Okay, let's move on to speaking. The speaking part of the exam is divided into 3 parts. So we're going to take a look at part 1 together first. Part 1 is between 4 and 5 minutes. So let's have a look at some examples. The first example you can see is, do you work or are you a student? Then we have, do you have a large or small family? What do you like about your home? And what are your hobbies? So from these questions, we can see that they are all very familiar topics. That means the examiner will choose topics that are easier to talk about, things that we're used to talking about on a daily basis. These can include your work or your studies, family, home, or hobbies. You'll also notice that all of these questions are about you. That means you should talk about yourself personally. Extending your answers shows the examiner that you can use English. So if the examiner asks you, do you work or are you a student? And you say, I'm a student, it's not really enough. It doesn't show the examiner what English you have. Try to give nice full answers, perhaps 3 or 4 sentences. But be natural. We don't want our answers too long either. For example, if somebody asks you where you live, it's not normal to talk about that for 2 minutes. So try to keep them as natural as possible. Remember to stay on topic. So if the examiner is asking you about the food that you like, you should really just focus on the different types of cuisine. Now please remember that your pronunciation and your fluency really do matter. They account for 50% of your mark. So what some candidates or students have a tendency to do is they worry a little bit too much about their grammar and vocabulary, and this can really affect their fluency and their pronunciation, which is 50%. So try and give an equal amount of importance to each of the different areas. So now let's take a look at part 2 of the exam. Part 2 takes about 3 minutes in total. You will get a topic card from the examiner, and he will give you 1 minute to prepare your talk. You should then try to talk for up to 2 minutes. So if we have a look, we've got an example of a topic card. It tells you about what you need to talk about, and it gives you some pointers as to what you need to include in your talk. Now during the 1 minute, use your time wisely. Make short notes. Try not to write full sentences. You simply don't have enough time. So try and just write the key words and the vocabulary that you'd really like to include in your talk. These mainly will include your nouns, verbs, and some nice adjectives. When you begin your talk, try to use an opener, something like, I'm going to tell you about. And then, as much as you can, try to paraphrase the topic on the topic card. Similarly, when you're closing your talk, you can end by saying, so that's, and then paraphrase whatever the topic says on the card. It's important to organize your talk too. Use phrases that make it easier for the examiner to follow where you are and introduce the areas that you are covering. Pay attention to the topic card, not just about the topic and about the vocabulary that you'd like to use, but pay attention to the grammatical structure. So let's take another look at the card we have as an example. It says, describe a film that you would like to see in the future. So we know that the examiner is expecting to hear some future tenses. A very common mistake is that the candidate starts in the right tense and then, because I think of the exam pressures, they forget and they start to use a different tense. So a way that you can help yourself is in big letters at the top of your notes, just make a note of the grammatical structures that you want to be using. Then this is a constant reminder when you refer to your notes as to what tense you should be using. Remember to try to expand your ideas and include interesting vocabulary. Stay away from more simple or general adjectives and try and give as much detail as possible. Remember, this is an opportunity for you to showcase to the examiner what you're capable of. Okay, so let's move on to part 3 of the speaking, which is the final part of the exam. Now in this part, it takes about 4 to 5 minutes, and the examiner will ask you questions that are related to part 2. This is always good to know because it allows you some time to mentally prepare yourself for what is going to come. Now, the examiner will ask you different types of questions. So the first type he might ask is an opinion, meaning he wants to know what you think about something. Or perhaps he'll ask you to evaluate a situation. That is, consider somebody else's opinion and say how you feel about it. Or you may need to speculate. Speculate will mean that you will talk about how things might be in the future. Cause and effect. So try to think about the reasons why something happens and what the result of that is. Hypothetical. Now, hypothetical refers to situations that are imaginary in the future. comparing and contrasting, so you're talking about similarities and differences, or he may ask you a question that refers to the past. So now let's look at some examples of questions and see how they relate to those different types. First question is eating out popular in your country? The examiner clearly wants to know your opinion. How is the way we communicate nowadays different to the past? So here he's asking us to both compare and contrast and refer to a past situation. How will transportation change in the future? Now you need to speculate. You need to think about how things will be in a future time. And finally, if everyone spoke one language, how would the world be different? So in this sentence, we can see immediately by the grammatical structure using the second conditional that this is an imaginary future situation. So it's hypothetical. It's not just to understand the topic, but also to understand what the function is of that statement. It allows you to answer in the correct way. Okay, let's take a moment to consider how part 1 and part 3 are slightly different. Now, in part 1, if the topic is food, the examiner might ask you, where do you like to eat? But if we have a look at the example we have here, it says in part 3, is eating out popular in your country? Now remember, in part 1, the examiner wants to know all about you. But when it comes to part 3, he's no longer asking about you, he's asking about people in general. So it's important to keep that in mind. Keep your ideas and your answers open. You're expected to develop and support your ideas. That is, give a clear opinion and then give some reasons and examples and explanations to develop that idea.